March 8, 1942. The sun had barely risen over the Brooklyn shipyards, yet the air already vibrated with the rhythm of hammers striking steel. Steam curled from freshly welded seams, mingling with the acrid scent of molten metal and coal smoke. Workers, men and women alike, moved with urgent precision, some swinging sledgehammers, others getting massive steel plates into place. The clamor of machinery was a soundtrack to desperation. Every strike, every rivet, a race against time. Beyond the fences, across the Atlantic, German U-boats lurked beneath the grey waves, waiting to intercept the lifelines of Britain. Cargo ships vanished nightly into the deep, swallowed by torpedoes and ice-cold waters. The Allies' survival depended on these massive steel hulls, yet the threat seemed insurmountable. Among the newly constructed vessels, one ship glistened under the pale morning light, a Liberty ship, simple in design, fast to build, yet destined to become a lifeline in a war that threatened to engulf the world. It was a ship born of necessity, mass-produced yet vital, a floating promise that America could deliver not just steel, but hope across the oceans. And soon, these ships would meet the relentless hunters beneath the waves. By early 1942, the world was engulfed in chaos. Europe had fallen under the shadow of Axis control. France was occupied, the Low Countries had crumbled, and the Luftwaffe still patrolled the skies over London. Across the Atlantic, the British Isles depended entirely on shipments of food, ammunition, and equipment from the United States and the Commonwealth. Without them, Britain could not sustain its war effort. Yet, every crossing of the Atlantic was a gamble with death. German U-boats prowled the oceans in wolf packs, submerged predators striking without warning. By March 1942, the Kriegsmarine submarines had sunk hundreds of Allied merchant ships, cutting vital supply lines. Each torpedo that struck the steel hull of a freighter threatened to tip the scales of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a strategic duel. On one side, the Axis undersea menace. On the other, the fragile hope of a lifeline stretching from North America to the British Isles. The Allies faced a problem as stark as it was urgent. Britain's domestic shipyards were depleted, battered by repeated bombings. The merchant fleet had suffered catastrophic losses. In January 1942 alone, over 250,000 tons of Allied shipping had been destroyed. Supplies were dwindling, and the spectre of starvation loomed over London, Glasgow, and Liverpool. Convoys could no longer rely solely on escort vessels. The sheer numbers of ships were insufficient against the relentless German submarine threat. Across the ocean, the United States was awakening to the full scale of its responsibility. Prior to Pearl Harbor, American shipbuilding had been a modest industrial activity, focused on commerce rather than wartime urgency. But the attack on December 7, 1941, had transformed the nation overnight. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, tasked with producing not just weapons, but the very ships that would keep Europe supplied. Steel mills roared back to life, shipyards expanded by the week, and tens of thousands of men and women, many of whom had never touched a welding torch before, were trained to build the vessels that could carry the war across the Atlantic. It was clear that traditional shipbuilding methods would not suffice. British freighters had taken months to construct, relying on rivets and skilled laborers in dwindling numbers. The Axis, particularly Germany, could sink them faster than they could be replaced. Allied planners needed a ship that could be built quickly, in vast quantities, and still survive the perils of the Atlantic. The design had to be simple yet effective, fast to assemble without compromising durability, a ship that could be built in weeks rather than months. The solution emerged in the form of the Liberty ship. Modeled on a pre-war British design, it was not beautiful nor graceful. Its lines were utilitarian, almost crude, steel rectangles welded together, engines powerful but unspectacular, hulls designed more for function than speed. Yet within this simplicity lay genius. Standardization allowed parts to be manufactured across multiple shipyards, then brought together for rapid assembly. Welding replaced rivets, cutting construction time drastically. Modular techniques meant that a hull could be assembled in stages, each team working simultaneously on different sections. By March 1942, shipyards along the U.S. East Coast, from the Kaiser yards in Richmond to the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyard in Baltimore were cranking out Liberty ships at unprecedented rates. A hull that once would have taken half a year to build could now be completed in 6 weeks, sometimes less. For a nation untested in such industrial mobilization, it was a triumph of organization and engineering. Yet the stakes could not have been higher. Each ship that left the yard carried with it the lives of sailors, the survival of allied nations, and the fragile hope that the Atlantic lifeline would hold. As convoys began to form, these ships became more than vessels of steel and rivets. They became symbols of resilience. Each hull represented not just cargo, but the determination of a nation rising to meet a global crisis. The Liberty ships were the answer to a question that had haunted Allied planners for months. Could production outpace destruction? And in a war defined by speed, strategy, and steel, the answer would soon be tested on the rolling, treacherous waves of the North Atlantic. By mid-1942, the United States had fully mobilized for war. The U.S. Maritime Commission, established in 1936 but largely dormant, now became the central authority for producing the ships the Allies desperately needed. Its mandate was simple yet daunting: build ships faster than the enemy could sink them. Traditional methods of shipbuilding, relying on craftsmen, riveting, and incremental assembly, were far too slow. Something revolutionary was required. The Liberty ship was born from this necessity. Its design originated from a British tramp steamer, the Empire Liberty, known for its durability and simplicity. American engineers modified it for mass production, reducing intricate detailing and emphasizing straight lines and modular components. The hulls were welded rather than riveted, a process that was faster and required fewer skilled laborers. Welding, however, was not without risk. Early Liberty ships occasionally suffered brittle fractures in cold waters, a flaw quickly addressed by improved steel alloys and stress testing. Shipyards along the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and West Coast rapidly expanded. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, became emblematic of this industrial surge. Entire communities of temporary housing sprang up around these yards to accommodate tens of thousands of workers. Men drafted into defense industries, women leaving traditional roles to enter the workforce, and immigrants seeking stable employment all joined the effort. By 1943, women comprised nearly 40% of the shipyard workforce, a revolutionary social shift for the United States. The scale of production was staggering. Before the war, American shipyards averaged 1 or 2 large ships per year. By 1942, Liberty ship production had accelerated to more than 1 per week at some yards. Modular assembly allowed separate teams to work on the bow, stern, engine room, and superstructure simultaneously. When welded together, the pieces formed a complete ship ready for launch in mere weeks. The record set by the SS Robert E. Peary was an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch, a feat that symbolized the industrial might of the United States. These ships were not luxurious. Interiors were Spartan, designed purely for function: a boiler room, cargo holds, minimal accommodations for a crew of 44 to 50 sailors. Yet they carried tons of supplies: food, ammunition, tanks, trucks, and sometimes even aircraft, destined to reach beleaguered Allied forces in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Each Liberty ship represented a promise that no blockade, no U-boat wolfpack, could sever the lifeline between America and the front lines of the war. The psychological impact was as important as the material one. British officials watched with awe as convoys of Liberty ships began to cross the Atlantic. Winston Churchill, acutely aware of Britain's reliance on shipments from North America, described the program as the engine of survival, a phrase that underscored both urgency and admiration. These vessels became a beacon of hope, visible proof that the United States could deliver not just weapons, but confidence and resolve. Yet for all their promise, the Liberty ships faced a brutal baptism. German U-boats prowled the North Atlantic in ever-growing numbers, coordinating attacks with devastating efficiency. Convoys were vulnerable, with supply ships often traveling in tight formations under constant threat of torpedo strikes. The early months of 1942 demonstrated both the necessity of the Liberty ships and the peril that awaited them. Each ship launched from the yards was more than steel. It was a statement of defiance, a wager against the deadly precision of the Kriegsmarine. The U.S. effort transformed the war in ways that extended far beyond the shipyards. Entire cities were energized by the pace of production. New technologies in welding, prefabrication, and labor management emerged, many of which would influence industrial practice long after the guns fell silent. The Liberty ships, crude yet functional, had become symbols of a broader strategy: overwhelm the enemy with sheer volume, ensure the flow of supplies, and keep the Allied war machine moving forward at all costs. As the first convoys of Liberty ships prepared to depart, attention hung over the Atlantic. Would these vessels, products of speed and necessity rather than elegance or design, survive the harshest ocean and the most ruthless enemy? The coming months would test not only the ships themselves, but the very idea that industry could shape the outcome of a global war. Human angle. In the sprawling shipyards of the United States, human determination became the beating heart of the Liberty ship program. Workers arrived before dawn, their hands raw from welding torches, hammers, and steel plates. Among them were men drafted from factories, farmers' sons, and immigrants seeking opportunity. Alongside them stood thousands of women, nicknamed Rosies, who had never before handled tools designed for metal and fire. Each strike of a hammer, each welded seam, was an act of defiance against the enemy lurking across the Atlantic. Fatigue was constant. Shifts often extended beyond 12 hours, yet morale remained high, fueled by the knowledge that each ship leaving the yard could sustain the life of soldiers and civilians abroad. Apprentices learned on the job, sometimes under the guidance of seasoned welders who had mastered their craft in peacetime. Accidents were inevitable: burns, crushed fingers, minor collapses, but safety could not delay production. Stories circulated of workers saving each other from molten steel and collapsing scaffolds, forging bonds that transcended nationality and background. These men and women were more than laborers. They were architects of survival, turning raw steel into floating lifelines. Technological angle. The Liberty ship was a triumph of pragmatic engineering. Its design prioritized simplicity, standardization, and mass production. Welding replaced rivets, reducing both construction time and the need for highly skilled labor. Prefabricated sections allowed multiple teams to assemble a ship simultaneously, a method revolutionary for the 1940s. Engineers meticulously calculated weight distribution, hull strength, and cargo capacity, ensuring that despite rapid construction, the vessels could survive storms and torpedo strikes. Yet innovation carried risks. Early Liberty ships experienced brittle fractures, particularly in icy waters. The SS Schenectady, for example, broke apart while docked due to steel fatigue, a warning that prompted rapid adoption of improved steel and welding techniques. Every failure became a lesson, and each adjustment increased the ship's reliability. Engine rooms were standardized, designed to be maintained by minimal crew under arduous conditions. Cargo holds could be rapidly loaded and unloaded, turning the vessels into efficient arteries of war. Technological ingenuity had met industrial pragmatism. The Liberty ship was proof that simplicity, when executed precisely, could overcome complexity in wartime. Leadership angle. Behind the steel and sweat, leadership steered the Liberty ship program with unwavering focus. Franklin D. Roosevelt, recognizing the strategic necessity, mobilized the federal government and private industry with urgency and clarity. The U.S. Maritime Commission, led by Vice Admiral Emory S. Land, coordinated production across hundreds of shipyards, negotiating contracts, allocating materials, and ensuring that bottlenecks were eliminated. Shipyard managers, too, displayed remarkable ingenuity. Henry J. Kaiser's approach to modular construction and labor organization became a model for mass production. Union leaders worked with management to maintain high morale, resolve disputes, and integrate women and minority workers into previously exclusive workforces. Across the Atlantic, British Admiralty officials monitored progress closely, communicating specifications and convoy schedules to ensure that each ship delivered maximum strategic value. Leadership at every level, from the White House to the assembly line, was the invisible hand guiding the creation of a vessel that would change the course of the war. Enemy angles. Across the Atlantic, the German Kriegsmarine watched with calculated patience. U-boats, the underwater predators of the Battle of the Atlantic, stalked Allied convoys in coordinated wolf packs. These submarines, armed with torpedoes capable of sinking a Liberty ship in moments, were the embodiment of Germany's maritime strategy: disrupt supply lines, starve Britain into submission, and prevent the Allies from sustaining a prolonged war. Each ship that left an American yard carried not just goods, but the lives of sailors into a deadly theater where a single mistake could mean annihilation. Intelligence reports often reached U-boat commanders detailing convoy compositions, sailing routes, and departure dates. Yet the sheer volume of Liberty ships soon overwhelmed even the most disciplined wolf packs. By mid-1942, Germany realized that sinking ships faster than the Allies could produce them was no longer feasible. The Liberty ships' rapid production, combined with convoy protection tactics, forced the enemy to adapt, stretching their resources thinner with every crossing. The U-boats remained deadly, but the balance of power in the Atlantic had begun to shift, not through superior firepower, but through resilience, volume, and ingenuity. Tactical angle. The Liberty ships were more than cargo vessels. They were central to Allied naval strategy. Traveling in convoys escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft, these ships became the backbone of the transatlantic supply chain. Tactical innovations emerged alongside the ships themselves: zigzag patterns to evade torpedoes, coordinated anti-submarine patrols, and sonar-equipped escort vessels. Each Liberty ship carried not only supplies, but the calculated hope that careful navigation and strategic planning could outmaneuver a ruthless enemy. Convoy routes were planned meticulously, taking into account weather, enemy intelligence, and the limitations of the ships themselves. Captains learned to rely on experience, instinct, and constant vigilance. The Liberty ships' Spartan design, though slower than warships, allowed them to carry immense cargo, and their sheer numbers meant that even when attacks occurred, the overall loss could be absorbed without collapsing supply lines. Tactically, the program exemplified a simple truth of war: quantity, reliability, and coordination could counter quality, speed, and aggression. Moral and psychological angle. Beyond steel and strategy, Liberty ships carried hope. In Britain, news of an arriving convoy lifted spirits. Soldiers on the front lines, civilians in bombed cities, and families struggling under rationing all depended on these ships. The knowledge that America was producing them by the dozens became a psychological shield against despair. Winston Churchill wrote in private correspondence that the Liberty ships were not merely vessels, but a symbol that the free world would endure. On the American home front, shipyard workers understood that each ship was more than labor and steel. It was a tangible contribution to humanity's fight against tyranny. Letters from sailors, newspaper accounts, and wartime photographs circulated widely, reinforcing the notion that industrial effort could translate directly into survival. For the men and women building them, and for those awaiting their arrival, Liberty ships were embodiments of resolve, courage, and shared purpose. Connection to climax. These angles, the human courage, technological innovation, strategic leadership, relentless enemy, tactical execution, and moral significance, converge as the Liberty ships leave the safety of the shipyards. The stage is set for the decisive tests in the Atlantic, where the first mass convoys would face U-boat attacks, storms, and the ultimate proof of whether speed and ingenuity could outmatch destruction. The Atlantic would soon decide if the Liberty ships were merely industrial achievements or the lifelines that could turn the tide of a global war. September 1942. The North Atlantic was a gray expanse of waves and fog, stretching endlessly between the United States and Britain. Convoy SC-107, a formation of 55 Allied merchant ships, half of them Liberty ships, set out from Sydney, Nova Scotia, bound for Liverpool. Their cargo was essential: ammunition, food, vehicles, and raw materials that Britain could not survive without. On deck, sailors tightened lines, checked engines, and scanned the horizon, unaware that beneath the waves, German U-boats were already shadowing their route. The convoy's escort was modest: 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers. The Atlantic in autumn was a cruel teacher: gale force winds, freezing spray, and unpredictable currents tested both men and machines. Liberty ships, robust but slow, plowed through the waves at barely 11 knots. Crews endured sleepless nights, constant vigilance against torpedo tracks, and the deafening roar of engines fighting the Atlantic's fury. Each ship's deck was a stage of human resilience, where fear and determination coexisted in equal measure. On the evening of September 23, German Wolfpack Ice Bear engaged the convoy. U-boats struck in coordinated patterns, surfacing briefly to radio coordinates before disappearing into the cold black depths. Torpedoes sliced through the Atlantic, detonating against steel hulls. Liberty ships were hit. Some sank within minutes, while others limped forward, patched hastily by resourceful crews. The SS Empire Sunrise went down with nearly all hands, a grim reminder of the stakes. Yet even amidst chaos, the convoy pressed on. Tactically, the Allies had adapted. Escorts used sonar to detect submerged threats, deploying depth charges in carefully calculated patterns. Liberty ships zigzagged, a simple but effective maneuver that disrupted torpedo targeting. Signals flashed from bridge to bridge, coordinating maneuvers in near-impossible conditions. For every ship lost, 2 pressed forward, and the sheer volume of vessels meant that the convoy could absorb attacks without catastrophic failure. It was a war of attrition on a scale rarely witnessed, and the Liberty ships' numbers were proving decisive. The human element was equally remarkable. Crews worked tirelessly, often without sleep, tending to flooding compartments, manning emergency pumps, and keeping engines running despite relentless shelling and torpedo hits. Officers shouted orders above the roar of wind and surf, sailors risked life and limb to secure cargo, and medics attended to the wounded in cramped, rolling quarters. Every action mattered, for survival was as much about endurance and coordination as it was about steel and firepower. By dawn, the convoy had suffered losses, 10 ships gone, dozens damaged, but the majority had crossed into safer waters. Escorted by planes as far as the western approaches, reports from the Admiralty highlighted the significance. Despite relentless U-boat attacks, Liberty ships carried the bulk of their cargo intact. For the first time, it became clear that industrial production could outpace destruction, and that the Allies' lifeline across the Atlantic was more resilient than German intelligence had anticipated. The experience of SC-17 became a blueprint. Subsequent convoys would adopt improved anti-submarine tactics, incorporate air support earlier, and rely on Liberty ships' sheer numbers to overwhelm enemy attacks. Yet the Atlantic remained unforgiving. Each crossing tested the limits of human courage, technological ingenuity, and leadership under fire. Liberty ships were more than vessels. They were the physical embodiment of a strategic gamble, a gamble that would determine whether Britain could endure, whether the Allied war effort could continue, and whether the industrial might of America could reshape the battlefield. The events of these convoys foreshadowed a larger truth. Speed, scale, and resilience could defeat even a predator as deadly as the U-boat. The tide of war was not turning with a single battle, but with the relentless, measured advance of steel hulls cutting through storm-tossed seas, carrying supplies, hope, and the will to survive. Late 1942, convoy on 154 departing New York for Liverpool carried 62 Liberty ships among its ranks, escorted by a fleet of destroyers and corvettes. The stakes had grown higher. German intelligence had learned the routes, and wolfpacks, some numbering 20 submarines, patrolled with lethal precision. For the sailors aboard the Liberty ships, the ocean was both a conduit of hope and a theater of imminent death. As the convoy moved northward, Atlantic storms battered decks with freezing rain and waves that climbed like walls of gray steel. Visibility was near zero. Crews clung to rails, drenched to the bone, as engines strained against the relentless push of wind and tide. The Liberty ships' engines, simple and reliable, were pushed to their limits. The men who operated them were pushed even further, working in conditions where a single error could mean capsizing or sinking under torpedo strike. On November 27, 1942, the convoy encountered U-356 and U-604, 2 submarines part of a larger wolfpack. Torpedoes struck 3 Liberty ships in quick succession. Flames erupted on deck, lifeboats were lowered into a churning sea, and sailors scrambled to abandon ship. Yet the majority of vessels pressed on, aided by destroyer escorts that dropped depth charges in calculated patterns, forcing U-boats to dive and temporarily lose contact. Coordination, training, and sheer numbers allowed most of the convoy to survive despite the enemy's precision. The cumulative effect of repeated convoys became apparent. U-boat commanders began reporting difficulty in sinking Liberty ships en masse. Even when a torpedo found a hull, crews often managed temporary repairs at sea, using pumps and makeshift patches to keep damaged vessels afloat until port. Liberty ships, though not designed for speed or combat, proved resilient under fire. Every surviving vessel strengthened Allied confidence and demonstrated the viability of a mass production strategy against a formidable, technologically sophisticated enemy. Tactically, the Battle of the Atlantic evolved. Convoys became larger, air cover extended farther, and Liberty ships formed the backbone of transatlantic supply lines. The simple, utilitarian design of the vessels allowed crews to maintain and repair them under duress, while modular construction meant that losses could be replaced rapidly. By mid-1943, the rate of Liberty ship construction outpaced U-boat sinkings, fundamentally altering the calculus of naval warfare. The enemy could no longer sever supply lines decisively, and the Allies' lifeline across the Atlantic grew stronger with each voyage. Human stories from these crossings added depth to the steel hulls. Sailors recounted nights of terror as torpedoes slammed into neighboring ships, the roar of explosions mingling with the relentless wind. Officers organized firefighting brigades on rolling decks, medics treated frostbitten hands and shock, and ordinary men became extraordinary through courage and discipline. Across the Atlantic, in ports from Liverpool to Glasgow, dockworkers waited anxiously for the arrival of Liberty ships, knowing that the survival of soldiers and civilians alike depended on the timely delivery of cargo. The turning point was not a single dramatic engagement, but the accumulation of these crossings. Liberty ships, produced faster than the enemy could destroy them, began to redefine naval strategy. They demonstrated that industrial scale could offset technological superiority, and that resilience, volume, and human determination could outmatch even the most precise and deadly adversary. By the end of 1943, the Allies' logistical advantage was undeniable. Liberty ships had become more than vessels. They were instruments of strategy, symbols of industrial might, and lifelines that sustained the war effort. As the Atlantic convoys continued, it became clear that the Liberty ships' contribution would be decisive. The U-boats remained dangerous, but they could no longer dictate the tempo of the war. The Allies, through steel, determination, and coordination, had tilted the balance. The human cost was immense, yet the strategic victory was emerging. The flow of supplies, the endurance of Britain, and the eventual opening of new fronts in North Africa and Europe were all made possible by these mass-produced, resilient vessels. The stage was now set to assess the aftermath, the strategic, industrial, and human consequences of the Liberty ship program, and how these floating lifelines shaped the course of World War II. The close of 1943, the impact of the Liberty ship program was undeniable. In just over 2 years, the United States had launched more than 1,200 Liberty ships, each averaging 10,000 tons of cargo capacity. Collectively, they transporting millions of tons of essential supplies, food, vehicles, ammunition, and raw materials across the Atlantic, sustaining Britain and preparing the ground for operations in North Africa, Italy, and ultimately France. The losses, while severe, were dwarfed by production. Where the Kriegsmarine sank dozens of ships each month, American yards delivered scores more. The war of attrition in the Atlantic had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The industrial implications were staggering. Shipyards operated around the clock, with assembly line techniques that had never before been applied on such a scale. Prefabricated sections were produced simultaneously across different sites, then brought together to form a complete ship. This innovation reduced construction time from months to weeks, culminating in the legendary SS Robert E. Peary, built in just 4 days and 15 hours. Factories producing steel, engines, and components were synchronized in an unprecedented logistical ballet. demonstrating that wartime production could redefine the limits of industrial capability. Human effort underpinned these achievements. Women, young men, immigrants, and African Americans entered the workforce in record numbers. Shipyards became microcosms of a nation united for survival, challenging pre-war social norms and expanding opportunities in ways that would leave a lasting impact on American society. For the sailors who boarded these vessels, the Liberty ships represented more than cargo. They symbolized the collective determination of a nation. Each crossing, despite storms and enemy attacks, was a testament to human endurance, ingenuity, and cooperation. The strategic effect was equally profound. Convoys of Liberty ships ensured that the British Isles could continue to resist, that troops in North Africa received vehicles and munitions, and that the Allied war machine maintained momentum even under constant threat. German U-boats, once the arbiters of the Atlantic, found themselves overwhelmed by volume and logistics. The psychological advantage shifted as well. Allied morale was buoyed by the sight of endless steel hulls pressing across the ocean, while the Germans faced frustration and diminishing returns from their undersea campaigns. By mid-1944, Liberty ships were no longer merely cargo carriers. They had become a linchpin in the global strategy of the Allies. Their ability to absorb losses, survive attacks, and deliver essential goods allowed the Allies to open new fronts with confidence, knowing that supply lines would hold. In this way, a shipyard innovation in Richmond, California, and Baltimore, Maryland, had altered the trajectory of a global conflict, proving that industrial capacity, when paired with human courage and strategic vision, could shape the outcome of war. The resilience of the Liberty ships also demonstrated a critical lesson. In total war, quantity can be as decisive as quality. While German submarines were technologically sophisticated and tactically skilled, they could not sink enough ships to break the lifeline. Each Liberty ship that reached port reinforced the principle that mass production, when executed with precision and purpose, could offset even the deadliest enemy. As the war progressed, the cumulative effect of the Liberty ship program became increasingly clear. Supply lines remained intact despite relentless U-boat assaults. Troops in multiple theaters received the reinforcements and materiel they required. And in Britain, the arrival of Liberty ships became a sign that the tide, though hard-won and costly, was beginning to turn. The early aftermath sets the stage for a deeper examination of long-term consequences. The strategic victory these ships enabled, the human cost, and the industrial and technological legacy that reshaped both the war and the post-war world. By 1944, Liberty ships had become a backbone of the Allied war effort. Over 2,700 ships had been launched by U.S. shipyards, forming a continuous artery of supply between North America, Britain, and the front lines. These vessels carried everything from tanks and trucks to ammunition and food, essential cargo that ensured the success of campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and later, the D-Day invasion. The sheer volume of supplies they delivered made clear that no U-boat strategy could starve the Allies into surrender. Liberty ships had transformed the Atlantic from a deadly gauntlet into a conduit of survival and victory. The human stories intertwined with these vessels were profound. Sailors who manned Liberty ships faced freezing winds, towering waves, and sudden torpedo attacks. Some ships sank within minutes of an impact, yet others endured near misses, patched hulls, and relentless storms to reach port. Diaries and letters reveal crews, mixture of fear and determination, of exhaustion tempered by purpose. Men repaired engines in freezing engine rooms, pumped water from damaged holds, and navigated in near-zero visibility, all while knowing that the Atlantic could claim them without warning. These acts of courage transformed steel hulls into symbols of endurance, courage, and human resilience. Onshore shipyard workers witnessed the tangible results of their labor. For women and men in the factories, the Liberty ships were more than jobs. They were contributions to a cause larger than themselves. Communities grew around shipyards, forging new social bonds and challenging pre-war norms of gender and race. African Americans, previously excluded from skilled labor, found new opportunities. Women mastered trades once reserved for men. The Liberty ship program became both a military and social revolution, proving that total war demanded total participation. Strategically, the ships' impact extended far beyond the Atlantic. Their ability to deliver enormous volumes of cargo allowed the Allies to maintain simultaneous campaigns across multiple theaters. In North Africa, supplies transporting by Liberty ships enabled sustained offensives against Axis forces, culminating in victories that opened the Mediterranean and paved the way for Italy's liberation. In Britain, convoys ensured that cities could endure bombardment and rationing while preparing for the eventual invasion of continental Europe. Each Liberty ship crossing the ocean was a tactical advantage, a reinforcement of strategic intent, and a lifeline connecting production with the front lines. Even the enemy could not ignore their significance. German naval reports by late 1943 acknowledged the futility of attempting to sink enough Liberty ships to cripple Allied logistics. Wolf packs inflicted losses, but the Allies replaced ships faster than Germany could destroy them. The Atlantic, once a theater of vulnerability for the Allies, had been transformed into a corridor of sustained strength. Liberty ships had proven that industrial ingenuity, coordinated strategy, and human endurance could overcome a technologically superior threat. The broader implications extended beyond the war. Techniques developed for rapid production, modular assembly, and labor organization would influence post-war shipbuilding and manufacturing worldwide. The program demonstrated that with clear objectives, coordinated leadership, and societal commitment, human and industrial potential could be unleashed on a scale previously unimaginable. Liberty ships were not merely vessels of war. They were instruments that reshaped modern industrial capability, social dynamics, and strategic thinking. As the final convoys of 1944 departed for Europe, the legacy of the Liberty ships was unmistakable. They had secured supply lines, bolstered morale, and enabled victories that might otherwise have been impossible. Their contribution was measured not only in tons of cargo delivered or ships launched, but in the lives sustained, the campaigns enabled, and the psychological impact on both Allies and Axis. The Atlantic had been transformed. From the foggy, perilous crossings of 1942 to the steady flow of thousands of vessels in 1944, Liberty ships had proven that resilience, scale, and determination could define the course of a global conflict. The stage was now set to reflect on what these ships meant for history, for technology, and for humanity itself. The Liberty ships were never meant to dazzle with speed or elegance. They were simple, utilitarian vessels, welded together in the thousands, built for a singular purpose, to carry life across a sea of danger. Yet in their plain steel hulls lay the embodiment of human ingenuity, resilience, and collective determination. They were proof that when necessity meets organization, ordinary tools can achieve extraordinary outcomes. Across the Atlantic, these ships became more than cargo carriers. They became symbols. Each hull represented the labor of tens of thousands of workers, the courage of sailors who faced torpedoes and storms, and the vision of leaders who believed that industrial power could shape the destiny of nations. Liberty ships carried not just ammunition, trucks, and supplies, but hope. They reminded the Allies that even in the darkest hours of war, ingenuity and perseverance could prevail. The legacy of the Liberty ship program extends beyond wartime statistics. They demonstrated that mass production, standardization, and human dedication could overcome technological threats that once seemed insurmountable. They reshaped the shipbuilding industry, transformed labor practices, and expanded opportunities for women, minorities, and unskilled workers, leaving an enduring mark on society. Strategically, they proved that industrial might could be a weapon as decisive as any battleship or submarine. In reflecting on the Atlantic crossings, the losses endured, and the victories achieved, one truth emerges clearly. War is not decided by a single act of heroism, nor by a single weapon. It is decided by the persistent, coordinated efforts of many workers in factories, sailors in the storm, planners behind maps, each contributing a small part to a larger outcome. The Liberty ships were the quiet giants of the sea, carrying with them the weight of nations, the lives of countless individuals, and the promise that determination, organization, and courage could tip the scales of history. Even decades later, the image of these steel hulks cutting through the Atlantic stands as a testament to human resilience. They remind us that sometimes it is the unassuming and the steadfast, not the glamorous or the powerful, that changes the course of events. In the vast theater of World War II, Liberty ships were lifelines, warriors of industry, and enduring symbols of humanity's capacity to endure, innovate, and prevail.